Okay, so imagine a locomotive chase during the Civil War that started with stealing a train outside of Atlanta and ended 18 miles short of its goal, but with the awardings of the first Congressional Medals of Honor and eventually a Disney movie. I can explain. We're starting off here in Nashville, Tennessee in 1862. The city fell to Union forces in February, becoming the first southern state capital to fall, and the next major city on their checklist was Chattanooga. The problem was Chattanooga was connected by railroad to Atlanta, so every time the Union Army came close to the city, reinforcements were sent and a counterattack came. So if they wanted to take Chattanooga, the easiest way was to shut down the railroad. And that's where this handsome gentleman comes in, James Andrews, who was a civilian that worked as a secret agent under Brigadier General Don Carlos Buell. It was Andrews that came up with the idea of stealing a locomotive and using it to travel down along the railroad, prying up rails, burning bridges, and cutting telegraph lines along the way. Luckily, telegraph lines were more often than not run along the train track, so it made it a lot easier. His first plan failed because an engineer in Atlanta that was their inside man to get the train ended up being transferred somewhere else, and of course they find this out after they had made it all the way down to Marietta and then had to turn around and sneak back behind enemy lines. And yeah, that took a week. So that plan was no bueno. But he brought the same basic plan to Major General Ormsby Mitchell, except the first time the plan had been to head towards Alabama. This time it was to aid in the taking of Chattanooga. Mitchell agreed and sent Andrews along with another civilian and 22 Union troops from Ohio, known affectionately as Andrews Raiders, to go down to Atlanta, steal a locomotive, and, tear shit up. Andrews instructed the men to make their way to a meeting point in Marietta, Georgia, dressed as civilians, and if questioned by Confederate troops, their story was that they were looking to enlist. At which point they were to enlist into that division and eventually figure out a way to run off. This contingency plan actually came in handy, seeing as two of the soldiers were stopped by Confederate troops and ended up joining an artillery unit, so they were out. The rest of them made their way to Big Shanty, now known as Kennesaw, where on April 12, 1862, they waited for the morning passenger train out of Atlanta about 27 miles to the south. And when she stopped so that the passengers could eat breakfast at the local hotel, they didn't have a dining car, and honestly dining cars weren't that common at that point. The Raiders detached the passenger cars, jumped on board, and took off. Okay, sometimes stealing a train is just a little too easy. Now, the locomotive was known as the General.
For a great low rate you can get online.
No. Anyway, the General's conductor was William Fuller, and yeah, he kind of went full on Buford T. Justice here. He and two other men began to chase after the General, first on foot and then by handcar. How mad do you really have to be to try to catch up to a locomotive with a handcar? Now, something to keep in mind here, as the Raiders were traveling, destroying what they could, they had to stop in order to do so. Plus, they had commandeered a train with a schedule. And in order to keep people from realizing what was going on, they had to stick to that schedule. This became an issue in Kingston, where they had to wait over an hour for a southbound train to pass through. And right as they were chugging on out of the station, who shows up? Yep, William Fuller. Luckily, by that point, he had come across another train on a side track and had taken it to Kingston. The Raiders cut the telegram line so the Confederates couldn't send a warning ahead and pulled up the rails so that Fuller's train couldn't continue its pursuit. And so Fuller was back on foot. By the way, apparently there weren't any horses available. You'd figured they'd just retake the train with horses, but no. Fuller did come across a southbound locomotive, the Texas, that had been conned into taking the side track to allow the General to pass, and seeing as he finally had a locomotive that could catch up to the Raiders, but it was facing the wrong direction, Fuller said screw it, got on board with 11 Confederate soldiers, and headed after the General backwards. Yes, for the next roughly 50 miles, a locomotive was chasing another locomotive backwards, going about 15 miles an hour, and because they were being pursued, the Raiders ceased to try and destroy the railroad, seeing as they didn't have time to stop, and they couldn't get any bridges fridges to catch fire since it was raining. They were, however, able to continue to take out the telegraph lines. Eventually, just north of Ringgold, Georgia, and 18 miles short of Chattanooga, they ran out of fuel and proceeded to scatter like roaches. The general was towed back to Atlanta by the Texans, and within a few weeks, all the raiders had been captured. Andrews and 7 others were executed by hanging. 8 were able to escape custody, including 2 that ended up floating all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. The remaining 6 were kept as POWs and were eventually traded back to the Union in March of 1863. These 6 men became the first people awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, well, the Army version. In fact, all but 3 of the soldiers involved were awarded the medal. And even though he came up with the idea and was the leader, James Andrews, a civilian, did not qualify and thus did not get one. The legend of the raid and chase grew. Buster Keaton made a film based on it, and I'd recommend it, but then again, I'd recommend anything with Buster Keaton. And Disney made a film about it during their Davy Crockett era, starring Fess Parker, who, yeah, also played Davy Crockett. And every year there's a festival in Kennesaw held in commemoration. Oh, and a fun little final fact here about Kennesaw, they have a law requiring gun ownership. Not knocking it, just putting it out there.